Hello, good evening. Hello. Hello, Harold.
Okay, there is Yaakov, Bernie,
Hi, good evening.
Jerry, and Saul are here. Okay,
Heard last week you had a big crowd, right?
yeah, because we had a mincha. We had mincha here.
What will French with Nida? Ja, habe ich nicht gesagt. What will French with Nida? Dann haben wir kommen.
I believe that we are on 183.
Correct.
Right. I think that's where we left off.
Okay. I will get that.
We were talking about that husband and wife cannot hand things one to each other during the Nida period as well as the Shavanakiyim period. We went through a whole analysis where it seems like the majority of the poskim hold that the Shiva Nakiyim have the same stringency regarding these harchakos as the Nida period. So we said that Rav Yehuda Herzl Henkin and Rav Yaakov Arhavtag, in cases of need or emotional stress, one may lie on the lenient opinions to pass a baby directly, especially given the chance that one may not have a sturdy surface upon which to place the baby. Right? Lifnei Chodesh, the shaila was to the Nishmas Habayis, Lifnei Chodesh Yeladadi to Oimim. Twins were born. Kach sheyesh lanu k'eit chamisha yeladim b'nei shmona umata. They have 5 children under the ages of 8. Lachar leidot, anu mitkashim ma'ot im archakot. The husband writes a letter and says, I'm having a hard time with the distancy requirements. The imapirud ha'aruch davka betkufa shabani zkuka bioter l'tmicha regishit. The distancing is making it difficult, especially at a time when she needs emotional support. Kasha lili shmor al iser, especially on the prohibition of havarata tinokot, passing the babies back and forth, or chafetzim acherim achad l'sheni, or a milk bottle or other objects that they might need. Hayim ein efsharut lahakel b'dvarim elu. So she wanted to know if there's a reason to be lenient. So the answer that was given, Isra avar chafetz miyad liad, nuad limnoa magavi kirva ben bnei azug. The restrictions of passing things from hand to hand between man and wife is to prevent intimacy between the couple when it's prohibited for them to have relations. Isra zegorim koshel hoy rabim, hein biglal atzorach betmicha regashit, ve'im biglal atzorach hamasi bezrat fizit betkufa musazu. He understands that couples need emotional support. They also need physical support. Like one should put the baby down. Sometimes you can pass it through a third party. He says, in the special circumstance immediately after the childbirth, the twins, לא תמיד ניתן להניח את התינוק על משטח פתוח על מנת להימנע מעבירה ישירה. It's not safe to put the child down, to have the spouse pick it up. לכן במקרה של קושי וצער, because of this difficulty and pain, רבנינו פוסקים שתוכלו לסמוך על המתירים להעביר ישירות את התינוק. You can rely in a difficult situation on the lenient opinions to pass the child directly. As long as the couple is careful not to touch each other. Contemporary poskim also dispute whether a husband may feed a baby being held by the wife when she is in nida. Rav Vosner is machmir. Rav Yitzchak Mordechai Rubin is lenient. Shevet HaLevi says, Yesh lachmir shel litein machal letinok shemachzicha biyada. He says you have to be machmir that even if the mother's holding the baby, the husband should not feed the baby. The Mara Cohen says, Isha machzeket biyada yeled, mutar la'aviv lachilo. He says it's permitted for the father to feed it and to put the sucking device into the child's mouth. As long as they don't touch each other. Occasionally a situation arises in which it's necessary to carry or shift an item which is too heavy or cumbersome for one person. Like, let's say, a baby stroller. May the husband and wife lift such an item together. The modern poskim dispute this. According to Rav Moshe Feinstein, it's forbidden. Just like any other case of passing items or indirect contract between husband and wife. Says Rav Moshe, to pick something up with his wife who's in nida, masui kaved, something heavy, or to fold a bed, even though he doesn't have a clear proof, mashma sheroy lachmi says, better to be machmir. If it's a light burden, it's more stringent. The nikr tzat that they're probably doing it in order to show some intimacy.
If you do pass something like that, like the stroller, what exactly is the halacha? I mean, the halacha is you're not allowed to do it, but you haven't done anything. You're not allowed to do it.
It's a rabbinic gzeira that you violated. That's what you violated. Okay, but we are knowing to be careful about rabbinic decrees as well, just like Torah decrees. You haven't violated a deraisa. You're not chayiv kores. Right. These are chakos. It's a fence. We stay away from things to keep us away from the bad things.
What about passing through another child?
Well, we said you can do it through an
That's
intermediary.
considered a third person. Okay.
Or like putting it down.
That's better than putting it down.
Says Rav Vosner, also says it's osir. Afilu b'davar shu aruch, like a long item, let's say a curtain rod or something long and heavy. They can't carry together a heavy item. Even though it's not hand to hand, they're carrying it together. However, Rav Ovadia Yosef permits it. He says one can rely on the opinion of those Rishonim more lenient in cases of need, such as this. Since this prohibition is not mentioned in the Gemara, some prohibitions are mentioned in the Gemara that carry much stronger weight. Something that's not mentioned in the Gemara that was produced by the Rishonim or after the close of the Talmud, so that some Rishonim are more lenient regarding that because it wasn't mentioned in the Gemara. Said Rav Ovadia Yosef, in Taras Abayis, which is a sefer on Nida. Mikomakom bal v'isha shedirosam bekomad voha. Husband and wife that live on the second or third story. V'yefshar le'echad mehem lo arida deglata tinok levado. Neither of them can take the stroller down by themselves. El rechova ir b'li siyum hasheni. They can't go downstairs without a stroller. They've got to bring the stroller downstairs, and they can't do it individually. Mutar lahem lo harid el rechova ir b'li siyum hasheni. Mutar lahem lo harid et hagala biyachad. They can do it together, as long as they don't touch each other. But often she's a ruchel lagas achad b'sheni. As long as they don't touch. Elohim ilfanim shalayik glavi. He's in front, she's in the back, or vice versa. There were mekilim, there were lenient sources, and you can rely on them in that specific case. Or they can go upstairs with it from the ground in the same way that's mentioned. Or let's say the husband can help his wife bring it up on the bus as well. Rav Hershel Schechter is also lenient in case of great need. Regarding carrying a baby carriage, one should only be carried by the husband and wife together if there's a great necessity to do so. So he summarizes basically everything we've read in that statement. Thank you. Is it permitted to throw objects to one's spouse during the nida period? Or is that similar to passing an item? The Rashbatz writes that it's permitted since only direct physical passing was forbidden. Ulashlich miyado liyada, throw a ball to her is not an isser, according to the Rashbatz. It means if you're not allowed to pass it from hand to hand, but throwing it from a distance where they're not going to come to physical touch was permitted by that Rishon. The Ramah writes that throwing is forbidden. So the Ramah is stringent. And even if the opinion of the Ramah is accepted, perhaps there's room for leniency if the spouse throws something high in the air so that it does not appear to be passed directly. The Piskei Tshuva cites the Kreisi Uplesi, who permits this type of throwing, but notes that the Sidrei Torah recommends not relying on this.
You're afraid that you might also touch the skin, is that it? In other
Yes.
words, if she wears pairs of gloves, she wears
Yes.
gloves, you're allowed to give her things? If she's wearing gloves, like the cooking gloves that they have, sometimes when you're behind the, when you're washing
hot
something,
gloves, yeah.
gloves, are you allowed to?
Jerry is asking if the wife is wearing gloves, you're not allowed to touch the skin. Well, the Ikar Adin, that's correct. And therefore, like if you have some kind of, but the spirit of the law, if you've touched her, we remember we brought the Gemara that you're not even supposed to touch her with your pinky, even with the Etzba
Right.
Ketana. So the spirit of the law is violated as well. Kirvas basar is skin to skin. Piskei Tshuva. Od kosar sham b'kreisi uplesi, sharon noyagin, shezorkin davar klapi malav, v'lo nochachish l'kmiskavin l'zrok liyada. That if you throw something up, not facing the wife, and she catches it, so that's not a problem. However, b'sidrei tarkos, avol b'sheyesh la'akel mirkadin mikol mokom in lahatir, kol ha'macher b'nyam elu, tov lo brach. He says, whoever is stringent in these matters, a blessing should come to them, because the whole idea here is to prevent a real isser. That's what this is all about. Rav Ovadia Yosef writes that strictly speaking, Sephardi may throw items, since this stringency was only accepted by the Ramah and the Ashkenazi poskim. Moreover, he writes that even Ashkenazi may be lenient in the case of throwing things high. So again, another difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim is highlighted here, right? Rav Ovadia says, to throw. So for example, if one has a milk bottle, So instead of passing it from hand to hand, according to Ravadia Yosef, they would throw it to each other. Or that's how they would transfer items from each other through Zrika. Ashkenazim have the minig not to do that because we follow the Ramah. So we would again have to put the item down on a table and they would have to pick it up from the table. Again, Shulchan says that even the Sfardim who are machmir on this will be blessed. He also says, Sof Dover Kol Nishma Shemekra Din Yesh Latir Zrika Miyad Liad Vehecha De Efshar. He permits throwing where it's possible. Tov Lizrok Achevetz Klapi. It's better to throw it high in the air. Uviyadasu Mekabel Seish, and then when it comes down, she receives it. Ulam Achenu Ashkenazim, our brother Ashkenazim Yotzim Biyad Ramah. They follow the Ramah. Shaposik Lachmir Bezrika Miyad Liad Mikol Makom. Yechol Lachmir Zrika Klapi Malik and Niskaleel. So Rav Avadia is posking for Ashkenazim that you can be matir, you can be matir according to the way the Pischat Shuva brought, that if you throw it up in the air and the wife catches on the way down, the Ashkenazim have a way out as well. What about during meals? Harchakas during meals. The Mishnah in Shabbos writes that a Zava, one who sees an unusual emission of blood not during the time of her expected menstrual period, may not eat with her husband because it may lead to excessive intimacy, causing them to sin. So already the Mishnah said that a woman who's in a state of tumah should not eat with her husband. The Rishonim assume, even though the Mishnah talked about a zava, remember we said that's the 7 days of nidus followed by the 11 days of zivu. She bleeds 3 days. She's considered a zava. We don't know. We treat all of our women as potential zavos. So the Rishonim assume that the same rule applies to women while they're in a state of nida nowadays, and discuss the precise parameters of the prohibition of eating together. According to the Rambam, the prohibition applies to eating from a common utensil. I guess at that time, people ate from the same plate. They didn't have a full set of china like we have. They all ate from the same plate. During the nida period, they didn't eat from the same plate. The Ravid, most other Rishonim are of the opinion that the couple may not eat at the same table, even using separate dishes. Omer Avram, so that's the Ravid. Anu noagim afilu al shulchan echad. We have a minig that we don't eat together on the same table. V'chein kosav ravacha. The Rosh suggests that even if we adopt a stricter approach, a visual cue known as a hecker can permit the husband and wife to eat from the same table. The presence of a hecker reminds the couple to cautiously maintain boundaries and parallels the requirement of a hecker with respect to two acquaintances who may not eat meat and dairy at the same table otherwise. We learned these halachas when we learned Basar B'Cholov, a year ago, in our Your Day Shiurim. There we talked that if you know each other, if you have two friends, they also need a hecker. If one's going to eat milachik and the other going to eat fleishik, they each need to eat on separate mats. And the same would apply between a husband and a wife in these situations. Says the Rosh, that which we see in the Rosh's time, the Rosh lived in Toledo in the mid-1300s. So he says that we do see men and women eating at the same table. Remember the whole business of the Seder, where each person reclined on a sofa, and each person was brought his own table, like a TV tray. So a lot of what we do on the Seder reflects the leaning, because they let on the thing, and we take the ka'ara off, we take the ka'ara on. This has to do with because the time of Chazal, everyone had their own table set in front of them. So the Rosh points out that was bimayhem, that everyone ate on their own table. Ukashishtu imal also cotton near a derachi. But now, when a husband and wife were able to be intimate with each other, they both ate from that same little table. So that's a sign of chiba, of closeness. The damilat sos mita. So a woman who makes the bed is not allowed to do that in front of her husband, because again, that is a sign of intimacy. And eating on the same small table with the husband would be the same thing. Or mezikas kos, the wife who diluted the wine, or hachatas panav yadav v'roglov, the wives used to wash the husband's feet. Boy, we've come a long way, baby, from that one. I'll never forget, when I started out in urology practice, I worked in Gardena, and there was a small Japanese hospital called Gardena Community, which was really old school. And the nurses literally would come in and give massages and wash the patient's feet. You've never seen anything like, I mean, it was real nursing care. That was, it's almost 40 years ago, but I remember seeing that. And it reminds me of this, but here, apparently the wives used to do it for their husbands. Avalai idna, so the Rosh is 800 years ago, but he's already lighter, seeing reality. Shekol b'nei abayis oichla shulchan echad. So today the whole family eats on one table. Eino derech chiba. So eating on one table is not a special sign of intimacy anymore. V'yesho yisim heker beinei. So he notes that husband and wives who were in their nida period would make a heker between them. Like Shulchan Aruch goes into detail that if someone eats meat and cheese on the same table, we went through these halachas about creating a heker. Hagos Oshri adds to his commentary on the Rosh that if they usually eat from one dish, but now eat from separate dishes, that qualifies as a heker. So according to the Hagos Oshri, if you ate on the same table, you wouldn't necessarily need separate placemats. The fact that you're eating for separate dishes, if they normally ate from one dish, that's enough of a heker. When she's not a nida, and their practice was to eat from one plate, and now they eat it in their own plate, so that's already a shinui, and it's permitted. So this is an important heter of the Hagos Oshri. And however, the Shulchan Aruch adopts the approach of the Rive and the Rosh, that a husband and wife may not eat at the same table when she's a nida, but a heker allows them to eat together, as does using separate tablecloths. A heker could be like a candelabra that's placed between them. It doesn't have to be necessarily a different tablecloth or different mat, different colored mat or something like that.
Mhm.
As does using certain. The Ramah then cites the ruling of Hagos Oshri. The Ramah brings this Hagos Oshri, who was more makel, who said all you need is separate plates. Shulchan Aruch says lo yochalim ala shulchan. You can't eat with her on the same table. Elam ken yeshum shinui. There has to be some kind of change. Sheyeshum davar mafsik bein karshal. There has to be something separating them between plates. Lechem, like a loaf of bread, or kankan, or like a jug, or sheyachal kolecha b'mapeh shelo. Or each has a different tablecloth or a mat like we have underneath their dish. Says the Ramah, yesh oimrim, the hadit shikin hefsik bein karshalo karshalo, haru davka kashein and oichlin bekarachas kashi toira. When you need this type of heker, that's only if they don't eat from the same plate when she's tohor. But if they ate from the same plate when she was not a nida, so the shinui of each of them eating on their own plate is enough of a shinui. And the Ramah says the Ashkenazim follow this Hagos Oshri. The Shach suggests along the same line of eating on separate tablecloths that's also adequate if one eats on a tablecloth and the other eats directly upon the table. So you don't need two tablecloths. One eats on the tablecloth, the other eats on the unclothed table. Says the Shach, "O shetigala ma'at min hashulchan v'tzin karshala alav." Let's say there's this, right? So they undo a little bit of the tablecloth, and she eats directly on the table. So the parameters for a heker parallel those necessary for someone eating meat at the same table as someone else eating dairy. These guidelines are summarized by Rav Mordechai Eliyahu in the Darchei Tahara. He says you can make this separation between husband and wife the following ways. To take an object that normally is on the table, that normally is sitting there, like I said, some people have a vase of flowers or a candelabra, or let's say they have a bottle of Coke, that bottle of Fresca, right? If they normally don't put it on the table. You could put a loaf of bread or a jug. If they're not using it for this meal, even if it's used for other meals, and it's something that they do leave on the table, that's enough as a heker. Not something that they're using for this meal, because that's not going to be a good enough hefsek. Number two, each person eats on a separate tray or cloth. If they eat that way normally, even when she's tohar, so he uses the shach to say that if normally they each eat on, let's say, a mat, so then you should use the eitzah of cover the table with a tablecloth. The man eats it on the tablecloth, or vice versa, and the other person flips the tablecloth off and puts it directly on the table. Or, let's say they each have a certain place where they sit on the table. She should change where she normally sits. That's enough of a heker. Or, let's say they eat from one plate, or they can eat on a different plate. Now, I don't think our minhagim is we eat on the same plate, so that's going to be a very rare thing. Most are machmir to require another heker. As long as they know that this is a change. That's if husband and wife eat on the same plate. Is that? Yeah.
It seems that it's the woman.
But maybe in the Sephardic countries. What were you saying here?
It seems that the woman is the one that has to make the changes.
No, I think it's here because
Is that
a
true?
man sits in a makom.
She's a nida. But he's not allowed to have relations with her. She's not allowed to have relations with him.
Correct.
So therefore, in other words, when you roll
Here,
the table
you're one.
over,
No,
why are you?
no, it's either one. The man could be on the table and she could be on the table. It's either one. Lav davko ifani me'elel kol shinui kayotze b'zeh. Any kind of change. Shabal v'isha magishin tamid be'avdel. The husband and wife see that there's something different going on. They're going to remember that she's in need of le'avoli. They care for Yisrael v'chi, but they won't come to intimacy. Hareza shuni. Ein tzarich shin zeh lios nikolei zarim. For example, strangers who come in, maybe they don't realize that there's a difference. As long as the husband and wife know that there's a difference, that's enough. Roy Latzniya, he says it's important to keep that modest, that other people don't necessarily know what you're doing. Is a heker necessary when the husband and wife are eating with others at the table? Let's say you're invited for Shabbos to a friend's table, and your wife is a nida, and you go as a couple. So these hekers, these changes, do you have to do that at that table? Well, you're going to see that the answer is going to be most people are not intimate or don't show intimacy when they're at a stranger's house. So it's going to be less problematic. This issue is subject to machlokas achronim, as well as a dispute among contemporary poskim. Some, such as the Darkei Tahara, which is also the opinion of Aruch HaShulchan and Rav Ovadia Yosef, are lenient to allow a man to eat with his wife without any visible cue at all, since no intimacy will be created between them in the presence of others. Says the Darkei Tahara, Kol hashinuyim ha'ele nitzrochim davke k'shnei hazug ochlim levadam. These separations have to be done when husband and wife are eating alone. Or let's say with the family. You're sitting down with a family meal. So they hold, on your children, you don't need a shino or heker if your children are at the table. They're not going to lead to intimacy in front of the children. What do children say? TMI, too much.
Right? And what's a shinu again?
Change.
Change.
Like putting the mat.
Something
That's a
different.
hecker.
PDA.
What was that?
You mean PDA, public displays of affection.
Right, PDA.
PDA.
You know, the children cringe, right? The children are cringing. So they understood that the couple usually will be modest in front of the children. What was that? Thank you. But they can't eat in the same plate. However, Rav Rosner writes that it's preferable to be stringent lechatchila, even in the presence of others. Though you can be makel if necessary. When other people are sitting with you, you should be machmir. If it's for great need, let's say you're at other people's homes, and people will recognize. We don't want that because we want people to be tsanua. Yesh busha. And there's people will be embarrassed if people will know that this is the period of time. Mekilim k'she'enam yoshvim levadam. You can be makel when they're not sitting private. The king or they're not sitting in a special place. That's already a hecker. In king k'shachem imam avi a hecker zehiris rak lechatchila. So Rav Osner is lenient if you need to, especially at other people's homes. Okay, so we see there's a machlokas regarding that. Can you eat your wife's leftovers off of her plate? The Rishonim mentions another hachaka related to eating, namely a husband may not drink that which remains in his wife's cup. And the Shulchan Aruch codifies it. Lo yishte mishirei kosher sahi. A husband should not drink the wine out of his wife's cup.
But the wife could drink this.
No, it's the same way.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
No, maybe not.
It's going to be the same thing. It's kiruth. He may not drink the remnants of the cup which she drank. It's going to be the same the other way. Maybe not. Okay, listen, that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Let's take what the Shulchan Aruch says. The Ramah presents a number of circumstances under which drinking the leftover liquid would be permitted. Im lo shemafsik adam acher beineim. Let's say somebody else is drunk from the same cup before he drinks. Let's say she emptied it into another cup, so then you can drink from it. Let's say she drank, and he didn't know that she drank from there, and he wants to drink it. She doesn't have to pipe up and say, "Oh, don't drink it." So you see, there's some leniencies here. Jerry is absolutely correct. She can drink from the cup that he drank from. So that is correct. Let's say she drank and left. He can drink the remnant. There's no special intimacy if she's not in the room. So the Ramah there gives us a whole number of kulas regarding that. In the last case mentioned by the Ramah, the Piskei Tshuva mentions that the husband may continue to drink even after she returns. Let's say she's out of the room. He starts drinking from her cup. She comes back. I am b'tshuvas yad Eliyahu shekasav di'im ba'asa be'emsa mutar likmor. If she walks back in, he can finish it. If she becomes an eater during the middle of the meal, he can finish the meal in a normal way before creating her chakras. Although the Shulchan Aruch only discusses drinking leftovers, the Ramah cites an opinion that this prohibition applies not only to drink but to food as well. She has some leftover. She has a nice piece of steak on her plate that she didn't eat, and you want to You're eyeing it.
Mhm.
So the Ramah says that the prohibition of drinking wine from her cup extends to the prohibition of eating food as well. Some hold that you cannot eat from remnant food. And this stringent position is accepted by Ashkenazim, as well as by Rav Mordechai Eliyahu. But Rav Ovadia Yosef takes the lenient position that leftover food is permitted, because the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch didn't say anything about that. The Shulchan Aruch, he takes the silence of the Shulchan Aruch as a proof that it doesn't extend to food. The same way that the Ramah took the silence, like Jerry learned, where it said that the husband cannot drink from her cup, and the Ramah was medayik from that. The Ramah deduced from the silence of a Shulchan Aruch regarding that she can drink from his cup. Says Rav Ovadia Yosef, since the Shulchan Aruch didn't talk about, it's the Ramah that said there are those that say you can't eat food. The Shulchan Aruch never brought any prohibition about eating food. So Rav Ovadia Yosef says, for Svardim, a man may not eat or drink the remains of a food or drink from which she has partaken in front of her because of its affectionate nature. However, it's permitted for a woman, Also, it's prohibited for a husband to eat or drink in front of his wife, food or drink that she ate or
The
drank,
remaining part of the food.
because of the intimacy that it involves. So number one, the wife can eat leftover food from the husband, even in front of him. But that's not going to lead to intimacy. Even if they add more food to the remains, he still can't eat the
So
remainder.
for the kiddush, when he drinks it, he puts the cup down, she's able to drink it?
Yeah, because we just
Right.
said she
Yeah.
can drink from the remnants of the
Right.
husband.
Mhm.
Did everyone hear what Jerry said? Jerry said something about kiddush, that when he makes kiddush, he puts the cup down and she can drink from it, based on this halacha. Yesh omrim shuadin b'achila, that some say that the prohibition of drinking the wine leftover extends to food leftover. Shelo yochel misher mechela shalishto nida b'fanea. V'chein haminhag etzel Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazim follow that prohibition. V'yesh matir v'chein das maran. There are those that are lenient. The Shulchan Aruch paskin like that. V'chein noagin mipnei dota mizrach. The Sephardic community will eat from her leftover food. Even Ashkenazi, more stringent regarding leftover food, may be lenient in certain cases. According to Rav Vosner, tasting a small amount of the food does not render the whole dish leftovers in this context. So, for example, the wife just tastes it. So that's not considered shirayim. Nor does the status of leftovers apply after a woman has taken some spreads. If she just tasted it, it doesn't passel the remaining food as shirayim. Number two, divrei maricha, like he's talking about like guacamole or hummus, spreads, mayonnaise, right? For example, she dips her spoon into this the communal spread, so that doesn't make the remainder shirayim. That is meant for everyone to use. It's got to start off as in her individual kli, like she has an individual cup and she leaves wine behind, or an individual plate she leaves food behind. Then there's an intimacy if the husband eats from it. Or marak bekar shalav, or she leaves some soup. Aval chavila shlema, but a full container of ketchup. A lot of people can lo choshev shirayim. The zoichav that's meant for everybody. The otum yachtoch echad prusame alechem. That what if one person cuts a little bit of a big loaf? Yachoshev akol shirayim. It's not considered a shirayim.
The Hasidic rabbis do consider it shirayim, though. But that's
Correct.
another story.
But-
Yeah,
But
that's
that,
another story.
that we know, that was meant that way.
Right, right.
Or we're talking about, let's say you gave her a half a loaf, let's say and she only cuts a small piece. I think what he's saying here, that would not be considered shirayim. What Yaakov is saying, like when a Rebbe cuts a loaf, that's certainly shirayim, because the whole concept is to go to the other people. So yes, I would agree with that. But let's say you gave her a small little bilkala, let's say you give a small challah roll that's meant for one person, that would be considered shirayim if she ate from some of it. Okay, sometimes you go to a simcha, right? And they give you your individual little challah. Sometimes, right? And that if she ate from that, you might not be able to eat from that. Okay, so we've been dealing. What about harchakot involving kalus rosh, which they define as frivolity?
Joking.
Right. Aside from the physical harchakot, it's forbidden for a couple to act with kalus rosh or frivolity. You can't flirt with your wife. You can't probably, making jokes, all that. It's prohibited. Chazal explained that it's necessary to insist on verbal, non-physical safeguards. Ezeu siug shasta Torah lidvareh. Eze siag. Well, what kind of fence did the Torah do regarding words that will go back and forth between husband and wife? When a woman is in need, lo tikrav. Don't come close. You might think you could hug and kiss, or talk with her frivolous words. Now, look at what lumped in as one group: kissing, hugging, frivolous words. So from here, we're learning that that's all considered one kind of problem. Talmud Lomer lo tikrav. So idle talk is considered an intimate thing. Now, not idle talk is forbidden during the nida period. Rather, the primary problematic type of discussion is frivolous chatter. As Rabbi Akiva said in Pirkei Avos, Rabbi Akiva Omer, schok v'kalus rosh. Kalus rosh means like a light head, like letting yourself go. And schok is like making jokes, right? So that margilin lavera, that leads to sin. The sin's frivolity can lead to sin. The goal is to reduce one's frivolous conversation with one's wife.
I think it's erva. Not avera, it's erva.
I've said margilin le'erva, absolutely. Margilin le'erva, which is sin, which is the avera of, let's say, of having a prohibited relation. So since it can lead to sin, the goal is to reduce one's frivolous conversation with one's wife during the period of nida to ensure that he does not come to sin with her. This measure of kalus rosh is given a code by the Shulchan Aruch. Lo yischok, you shouldn't make jokes. Lo yakel rosh ima, or act frivolously. Says the Ramah, afilu bidvorim, even with words. Shemeyargil aveira. Right here, it'll get them customary to committing sin. The Shach clarifies that the definition of verbal frivolity refers to the type of conversation that could lead to promiscuity, suggestive, or highly flirtatious behavior or speech. Says the Shach, the type of speech that leads to promiscuity. That is what the Tur mentioned when he talked about being careful with language. Now, despite this limitation on frivolous actions and speech, Rav Wosner rules in the Shevet HaLevi that it's permitted to buy flowers for one's wife on Shabbos, right? Uvinyan shiluach prachim labayit lekoved Shabbos kodesh, shriyesh lezeh makor b'shas in Masechta Shabbos Perek Beis, and in Kabbalah, that sending flowers has a source in Chazal. Nish'alti, Rav Wosner was asked, Im mutar b'mei nidasa, k'shekam levaisha samech b'zeh. When you bring your wife flowers on Friday, well, the wife is very happy with that. Is that going to lead to a problem? Ulefi dati aniyah, his humble opinion, ein b'zeh shum chashash. V'anan b'meichol yesh lachmir b'zeh. Im lo samach l'tarosa mamish. He says not to bring flowers if it's not Shabbos and she's in her needed period.
It was her birthday. You want to give her a little gift?
So as long as it's
You better not.
if she's close to her becoming tohor, he says okay.
He's really strict.
Mutar litain maton leishto b'zman, but he says you can give a gift to your wife. V'chein l'shagel l'prochim l'kavod Shabbos. So if it's your wife's birthday, you can give her a gift. Or you could send flowers. Or even though when you give her a gift, that causes close connection between husband and wife. Like the dinim we learned today, you should not give it to her in her hand. You should put it down and let her pick it up. Okay. Rav Yaakov Neuberger, Rosh Yeshiva at Rav Yitzchak Elchanan, writes that expressing love using words such as "I love you" may be permitted as well in many cultures, since it is often not considered an expression of extreme intimacy today. Armelo Talmidai, his students told him, some forbid expressing this kind of words between the couple. Says Rav Neuberger, Lanias Daiti, his humble opinion, each custom and what is said between couples is based on each society. Different demographies. He says it might be permitted in the time of the Nida. Rav Neuberger notes in support of his ruling that such expressions of love are extremely critical to be expressed during these times, since many women feel emotionally distanced from their husbands. We're talking about the needed time, especially during their early years of marriage, and need the emotional support of such statements. Rav Neuberger also discusses whether playing games such as chess are considered kalas. Can you play chess with your wife? He cites some poskim more stringent, such as Rav Elyashiv, but suggests that in the United States, playing such games is not considered an intimate activity that could lead to sin. They never saw the, Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. No.
Getaway?
No, Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway. He was a billionaire. He robs bank. Then they made then they made a remake of it.
Was that a bullet?
No, they made a remake of it with Pierce Brosnan.
Yes, about in a museum.
They rob a museum. They rob a museum. And there's a very famous chess scene between Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway that would go against this. Anyways. What about Kol Isha and Nida? The question of Kol Isha relates to the prohibition of achakot. Kol Isha is the term used when referring to the prohibition for a man to hear a woman singing. The details of this prohibition are subject to substantial discussion, and we will be dealt with in more detail in future Tzurba M'Rabanan volumes on Even HaEzer. Even HaEzer are the laws that deal with chuppah and kiddushin and other laws that relate to husband and wife, and that's where the laws of Kol Isha appear. Simply put, a woman's singing voice is defined by the halacha in a similar manner as certain concealed parts of her body. So we know that tefach b'sa'ara is considered an erva. If she reveals a tefach of her hair, an erva is a part of her body that should be covered. Of course, the intimate areas of her thigh, above the knee, that kind of thing. So the singing voice has the same status as erva. So in Masechta Bravos Amar Shmuel, Kol Isha erva, shenemar ki kolecha rev umarech naveh. Because the voice is also beautiful. The question before us relates to the application of Shmuel's principle to the laws of Nida. So the problem with Kol Isha is you listening to the singing voice of a woman that is otherwise prohibited to you, like an Eishes Ish, or a woman that you're not allowed to have relations because just you're not allowed to see unclothed parts of her body. So her singing voice is on. Now, during the period of the Nida, you're also prohibited to your wife. So does the prohibition of Kol Isha of your wife extend to the period of Nida? Is a husband allowed to hear his wife singing when she's in Nida? The question could be better appreciated if we examine the following statement in the Gemara in Shabbos concerning how the halachos of Nida compared to those of other forbidden women. Iboilu, Nida, Mausha Tishan Imbaila, He bevigda, Vihi bevigdo. Can a Nida, a wife who's a Nida, can they sleep in the same bed, her in her clothes, and you and the man in her clothes? Toshma, El Heharim lo achal ve'enav lo nasa, El gilulik beis Yisrael, this Eish Yisrael lo timei, Belishani da lo yikrav. It's a pasuk in Cheskel. Mekish isha nida la Eish Yisrael. So this pasuk compares your wife who's a nida to the wife of your neighbor. Ma Eish Yisrael hu bevigdo v'hi bevigdo aser. You're not allowed to sleep with an Eishes Ish in the same bed, even though she's in her clothes and you're in her clothes. So you as well cannot sleep in the same bed with your wife, even if she's in her clothes and you're in her clothes. According to Gemara, then, the rules concerning a man and woman who are not married to each other are somewhat equivalent to those of a husband and wife when she's in Nida, specifically concerning sleeping in the same bed. We've established that. The Pischei Tshuva is uncertain whether this comparison extends to the halach of Kol Isha as well, and would forbid a man from hearing his wife sing when she's in Nida. He's not sure. Says the Pischei, let's remind ourselves. We know the Mishnah Brura on Orach Chaim. The Chavetz Chaim passed away in 1933. The Mishnah Brura collected from the time of the Ramah, which was 1580, something like that, over a 300-year period, the later Achronim comments, and certainly after the Shachan Taz in Orach Chaim and the Magen Avram, and he brought us up to date the Eliyahu Rabbah, other major poskim particularly in the 1800s, Sam Sofer, the Noida Yehuda, and he brought all of the halachas up to date, up to 1933. Remember, the Aruch HaShulchan had done similar, although he didn't always quote who he's bringing it from. The Aruch HaShulchan passed away in 1910. Now, the Pischei Tshuva was the quote-unquote, he did the same service that the Mishnah Brura did, but he did it on Yoredeya. He lived up in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. So he brought, the Pischei Tshuva brought many comments of later Achronim to get us more up to date. For example, today in Yoredeya, the Refival Cohen who lives in Borough Park, the Badei HaShulchan, he is a contemporary the Badei HaShulchan is like the work on Yoredeya in the last 100 years. Because the Pischei Tshuva, as I said, he stopped in 1880. But the Badei HaShulchan it's now, I think, 3 volumes. The major sort of contemporary person who's brought up to date all the various shilas regarding Yoredeya. Kashrus, Basar V'chalav, he's certainly one of them. It's probably the most prominent one. So that just reminds us who the Pischei Tshuva is. He's giving us later Achronim's opinion in halacha. Afilu kol echad bevigdo tzarich iyun. He says it requires analysis. Imutu lishmo kol zemer shala. Can a husband listen to his wife's singing voice? The Gemara we just learned compared an Eishes Ish to your wife during her Nida period. In Kain near the Aser. Well, based on that, it would be prohibited. The Abba Eishes Re'eu Aser, you can't hear your husband, your friend's wife sing The cousin of Rosh Hashanah Perush Lishmoa. You're not allowed to hear her voice. So the Piskei Tshuva leaves it as a tzarchiyun. He doesn't know for sure. Some achronim, such as the Toafot Re'im, reject the comparison in regard to this case and permit kol isha for a nida. So he says, "V'isi la piskei tshuva v'yoredeya shenistapik." He was in doubt. Imuter labal lishmo kol zemer shalishto. For example, your wife wants to sing Zmiris at the Shabbos table. Can you listen to her sing? So the Piskei Tshuva was in doubt. V'aniya yisi omer shemuter. He is lenient. Lefi shema kosovar amosham, the muter listakel bi'ishto nida b'mkomos hagluyim. You're allowed to gaze at your wife during her nida period in the areas that they're allowed to be revealed, like her face. Even though he's getting pleasure from looking at her face. But that would be you're not allowed to gaze at another wife, at a man's wife's face because of her beauty. That's prohibited. Even you can't gaze at a single girl's face. That which they brought in Gemara Brachos, that if you listen to a woman's voice, it's considered like an erva. That compared it to, for example, gazing at a woman's beauty. Like it says, her beauty is, it compared staring at a woman's beauty. We're talking about her face, because the face can be revealed. We don't live in Islamic countries where our women cover their face. That's not part of tznius. The face can be revealed. It's very clear what halacha wants covered, but the face does not have to be covered. And therefore he makes the connection that, yes, by Eishasish, there's a connection between kol and mara. Just like kol is prohibited, mara is prohibited. But the Ramah is already paskin that you're allowed to stare at your wife's face during her time of nida. He says this is a proof that you can't rebut it. According to the Tosfos Re'im, the Toafot Re'im, the juxtaposition of voice and appearance in Shir Hashirim indicates that the two prohibitions are similar. Therefore, just as his staklus, gazing by the husband and his wife, is permitted while she's in nida, even though it is forbidden to gaze at other women, so too listening to her sing is also permitted. Contemporary poskim are also divided as to whether it's permitted to hear one's wife sing when she's in nida. The question is relevant not only to mundane singing, but also to singing Zmiris on Shabbos. According to Rav Moshe, in Igros Moshe, and Rav Vosner, it's forbidden to listen to your wife sing. V'davar kol bi'ishto nida, imuter lishmoa k'shemezameret, when she sings Zmiris. Hinei Piskei Tshuva nishar b'tzorach iyun, v'lachein me'aroi lachmir. So, you see, the Igros Moshe was very concerned about this Piskei Tshuva, who left it as a tzorach iyun, and he says, therefore, it's proper to be machmir. So it's fantastic that we learn through these makoros. We see exactly who the Rav Moshe relied on to be machmir. And the Shevet HaLevi says with Piskei Tshuva, same Piskei Tshuva we learned tonight, because of lesser lishmo kol zemer isha nida, digmor mekish leishas reyu, v'rak yichud itiru, they permitted it to be seclusion with one's wife as opposed to eishes ish. Umesik b'tzorachir, he left it as a tzorachir. V'lechor pashat liser the kol b'yisherva. Rav Vosner says it's clear that it's prohibited. V'chein kazav b'kitzur shulchan aruch, he brings Rav Gansfried, kitzur shulchan aruch, who said that it's prohibited. V'gam b'zmir Shabbos ein heter. Even if there's other family members there. Rav Hershel Shechter is also machmir. He says the Piskei Tshuva is uncertain about a man listening to the singing voice of his wife, out of concern that it may be categorized as areas that are normally covered. In practice, one should be stringent on this matter. But again, as we've seen throughout these shiurim on Nida, Rav Ovadia Yosef is lenient. Mutar lishma kol shir shel ishto nida. He says that you can listen to your wife singing. Aval b'shamar chachamim kol b'isha erva. Chen pasku atur v'shulchan aruch be'evan ha'ezer. She'asu lishma kol shir shel achas min harayos asur alav.
Yeah, but
That-
you see, when they're talking about that a woman's voice is erva when she sings, it's not talking about your wife.
That's what we've been dealing with for the last 10 minutes.
Right. It's not.
It is
talking-
dealing, the Pischei Tshuva compared the Gemara itself in Shabbos, Mekish Isha Nida Le'eshes Re'eyu. It made a comparison, just like you prohibited to do certain things with your friend's wife. The prohibition exists with your wife as well, who's a Nida. You're prohibited to live with your wife during a Nida period, correct?
Yes.
Just like you're prohibited to live with an Eishes Ish. So those prohibitions are connected according to Pischei Tshuva. Since you cannot listen to your wife's, to the wife of your friend sing, you can't listen to, when your wife is prohibited to you, you're not allowed to listen to her because her voice is also considered an erva. However, but you saw that the Toafot Re'im disagreed with that. So there's a machlokas achronim, whether or not you can compare the Isha Nida to the Eishes Ish.
Yeah, right. If it's
So-
not a nida, you're allowed. to
Of
listen to it.
course.
Yeah, right.
We're talking about when we're talking about when she's prohibited to you.
Right.
We're talking when she's prohibited to you. So the Shulchan Aruch, the Tur, clearly state that it's prohibited to listen to the voice of any of the women that are prohibited to you. We're talking about your sister, your mother, your aunt, your daughter. Those are ariases to you. You're not allowed to listen to their singing voice. And an Eishes Ish is an arias to you.
Right.
So those are prohibited. Now, Nida, your wife's as a Nida, is also an erva. You get kores if you have relations with the same punishment as the other ones. Now, you're not put to death. In the time of the Sanhedrin, if you lived with an Eishes Ish, b'mezid, you were put to death. If you lived with your wife, b'mezid, you got kores. There was no capital punishment. So it's different, but it's kores. Mikamakom be'ishta nida yesh lahakel, says the Ovadia Yosef. Your wife who is a nida, you can be lenient. Let's see his proofs. Shekivan says shofalios muteris lo yavoli de michshol. Listen, one of the problems, the Gemara talks about an Eishes Ish as stolen fruit. You remember the sugi in the Gemara where the guy's hot, and part of the allure of something that's restricted, prohibited to you forever, that's the allure. But your wife is going to be permitted to you in another 2 weeks. So says Rav Ovadia Yosef, the psychological aspects, it's listening to her voice, well, she's going to be permitted to you shortly. So it doesn't lead to a terrible stumbling block. The kosher came to Makam Tzarech. If it's need kagon shehi sharas shir eres latirika boicha. Let's say she's singing a lullaby to a crying child, which is a tzorech, to make him feel better, or kedei lardimot, to make him fall asleep. V'chein muter l'shir mishto nidas zmiras Shabbos. But Yosef says right away that she can sing zmiras with you. V'amachmir tov. He still says the machmir, whoever is stringent, will get a bracha. Some Ashkenazi poskim are lenient as well, including Rav Elyashiv and Rav Mordechai Willig. Rav Elyashiv is quoted in the Mishmeres HaTahara by Rav Moshe Mordechai Karp as being lenient according to the strict halach, unless she is singing for him. Rav Willig is recorded in a shiur available, and he gives you the site. We will conclude the shiur by noting that most of the harchakot between husband and wife are parallel to and extend beyond the restrictions upon any man and woman. Nevertheless, all agree that yichud, seclusion of a husband with his wife was a need, is permitted. Right? You sleep in the same room as your wife, you sleep in a different bed, but there's no problem with yichud. Right? Sugaba shoshanim, it says in Shirashim, shafilu kisugasha shoshanim lo yifritzu behen protzois. That it's a praise to the Jewish people that they do not jump over a fence made out of lilies. Why? because they observe both Torah law and rabbinic law. A certain min who was like an apikoris, some say it means a Christian. The word min is Maimin Yeshu Notzri. Maimin, believer in Yeshu Notzri, min. So that was edited and censored out of a lot of Talmudim. Rav Steinsaltz always, when he sees the word min, he always refers to it as the early Christians. So a min said to Rav Kana, Amrito nida shari liyechude b'hadei gavra. I heard it said that you allow your men to be yichud with the wives who are nida. Efshar eish b'nirus ve'ena me'averes. Can you bring a flame close to a wick and the wick doesn't light? He was saying it's a joke. How could you learn light? Amr leah Torah he'ida aleinu. The Rav Kana responded, no, the Torah gave testimony about Jewish men. Suga b'shoshanim. Shafilu k'suga b'shoshanim lo yifetzu ben protzos. That we are like a fence around lilies. That we don't even a fence made out of lily is very soft. You could go right through it, but we don't go through it. According to Shulchan Aruch rules that yichud is permitted, as simply being alone together is unlikely to lead them to sin if they have already had relations at least once previously. That means you've been married for a while. Once he had relations with her once, Sulo Sakif Yitzira, his Yetzer Hara for her is not so great. The principle does raise a major problem in the case of a chuppah nida, right? If a bride gets married when she's in a nida, or any other instance in which the kala becomes a nida before the couple has successfully consummated the marriage. In such a case, the halacha is that yichud is indeed forbidden, and another person must be present. You understand? If she's a nida before they've had relations, they can't have yichud either. That's why great efforts are made to try to prevent a chuppah nida. With, they use medicine and other things. Okay, any questions, comments, arrows, anything?
I would just say, Ernie, just that I think that the first volume of the Mishnah Berurah was actually finished before the Aruch HaShulchan. I think it was in 1888. So while most of it was the Aruch HaShulchan was later, I think the first one, the Mishnah Berurah was first.
Right, I just say he's passed away much later than the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan, by the way, the Mishnah Berurah is very good. He actually states who it is, and then you have he says the Eliyahu Rabbah. He'll bring you who the source was. Aruch HaShulchan less so. He'll summarize the halacha. He's not as as Vidayak is telling us exactly who he's updating the halachas with.
And of course, the Aruch HaShulchan is on all the sections of Shulchan Aruch, which is also helpful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, Yaakov, thank you for the recommendation of the Man Malki